Hi, welcome back. Thank you for coming back for the second reading of Everything Sad is Untrue. My name is Amy McKinty, and this is my second installment. Again, thank you for coming back. I gave a couple disclaimers when I started reading. One was that I asked you to be patient and stick with this memoir by Daniel Nayeri. It's told from his 7th grade perspective, so there's a lot of rambling. He goes back and forth in time, and his memory, especially of his childhood in Iran, is that of a young child. So we have to take that into account as we're listening to this story. So he's telling this story in a kind of back and forth way to his 7th grade class, who all have the assignment to talk about where they came from, a little bit about their family history. So he's doing that. My other disclaimer was that I'm trying my best with the Persian culture and language to look up the words and try to pronounce them correctly. And I'm doing the best I can, but I apologize if I butcher some of the words. But we're going to go ahead and continue with Everything Sad is Untrue. I heard this once. When the immigrants came to America, they thought the streets would be paved with gold. But when they got here, they realized 3 things. 1, the streets were not paved with gold. 2, the streets were not paved at all. 3, they were the ones expected to do the paving. The true story of Aziz is more interesting than a magic fish anyway, and took place beside a real river called the Aras. When she was a little girl, she lived in a big house surrounded by saffron fields. Do you know about saffron? Should I explain it? Okay, I'll explain. It's a spice that comes from pulling tiny threads from the middle of a flower. It's delicate and impossible to harvest with machines. You have to pinch them out of the flower by hand. In fact, I bet it's even more valuable than gold. Aziz's dad was a Khan for owning all the fields. They say he rode his horse in top hat and tails. He was a gentleman farmer. And they say he was kind to his workers. When the girls returned from the fields to the big house, everyone at the house could hear their laughter because saffron has an aroma that makes people happy. Sometimes a warm rain would soak the fields, and the flowers would give off their deep red color, rivers of red, like the yolk of sunset burst over everything. The workers' hands would be stained yellow, so would the ankles of the Khan's white horse. Aziz was the little princess of the Khan's grand floral sea. She read her books in the open courtyard, sitting on the inlaid tiles of the fountain, 1 foot dangling on each side, with an eye always on the horizon. When her father's hat peeked over the hill and the laughter of the harvesters was a far-off chime, Aziz would run into the house to tell everyone, "They're coming, they're coming!" Aziz ran back across the orchard to the bonfire. The old cook got his kiss on the cheek from the princess, waited for her to leave, and began barking orders. The whole house prepared for the feast, even Aziz. Her job was to fill 2 bowls with fresh yogurt from the sacks hanging in the basement larder, where the floor was packed dirt and where the old cook kept his pickling jars. Soon the dinner carpet was full with trays of kebab, grilled onions and tomatoes, platters of fresh chives, green and purple basil, cilantro, radishes and dill. The mountains of steaming basmati rice were capped with drizzles of saffron butter. A stew of chickpea, lamb, crispy shallots, and fried mint was the Khan's favorite. Aziz always sat beside him and made sure his plate never wanted for anything. He did not talk much, but held his wife's hand as much as possible. You can already feel it, can't you, in all this happiness, that some horrible darkness perched outside the house watching Aziz? And even those nights in the saffron fields, would be the best she ever got. Listen to me for a second. The life of Aziz is a tragic one. It was a real life. She was a happy Muslim girl in this part, but I only knew her as an old woman, bent in 2, with a face like dry soup, shut off from the world, shuffling around her little sod house by the ravine in her coverings like a black ghost. She would look at me, I remember, because she would smile, and the lines in her face twisted into unfamiliar shapes, almost like a grimace, almost like she was looking at me from the bottom of a well. She offered sesame candy from a dish beside the lamp that also had buttons on it. I remember because it was the first time in my life I refused candy. Those are the only two memories I have of Aziz, the little rivers of flowers and sewage, and a sad old grin giving me stale candy. I'm telling you this because it's important to count the memories. The rest is other people's memories, stories they told me some thousands of nights ago. Now that we are here in Oklahoma, I will never see Aziz again because she is too old to travel and I can never go back. Sometimes on the bus to school, I think of her and hope she has a gentle death. I hope she has more memories than I do. And I hope she forgives me for the ones I have of her. In my head, I tell her I will always think of her as the princess of a kingdom of laughing flowers. But the truth is that we are both exiles and will never go home again. The day Aziz became an exile is also the day she lost her father, the great Khan, forever. The legend goes that the Khan had to take a long trip. His fields stretched from northern Iran into Azerbaijan, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. For centuries, Russian and Persian dynasties fought over it, but at this time it was peaceful and the Khan rode back and forth without trouble. In the stories, the calamity is sudden. Somewhere else in the world, a mad king sent out his army. Not an important king. Aziz wouldn't even know his name. But the stars and the moon and every heavenly thing aligned to make the worst of all outcomes. And so the far-off kingdoms of Europe and Russia tumbled into the Second Great War. The drums of war had not yet silenced the laughter of the harvesters, but Aziz felt the first pinch of heartache when her father didn't return on the appointed day. They say he was in Azerbaijan when the war began and the borders were closed. I imagine it like an iron fence shutting behind him and scaring his horse. No one knows what happened after that. His fields on that side of the Aras River were taken by faceless enemies, and the Khan was never heard from again. It's easy to imagine it was from our side of history, to see the Khan's horse rear up at an encroaching darkness that pounces on him like a pack of wolves, to imagine him immediately drowned, to see his top hat floating away in a red river. But Aziz and her mother didn't have the comfort of certainty. To her, the darkness across the river was a cloud of endless unknowing. At any moment, she might see her babe, Baba, emerge with tales of adventure and a pocket full of sesame candy. Until the very last day, Aziz stared in the direction of the northern fields and wished for the Khan's return. But that was months after he disappeared, and by then, her uncles had already done their evil. For my class project, I would like to present the 1001 Nights, which will unconfuse you about some very important things. First, you have to know what Shahryar, who was a Persian king, not in true history, but in myth history. He had a wife we will not name because it would be embarrassing to her family. In the story, everyone except Scheherazade is a shame for their family, but the queen is especially shameful because she's an oath breaker. The king finds his wife in the garden copulating. That means sexing, but I use the official word because Mrs. Miller would freak out if I said sex in class, and Tanner would make kissy noises, and Kelly J would say, gross, either because of Tanner being slurpy or because she thinks I'm gross, and sex reminded her to remind me. So anyway, the king finds her cheating on him and goes crazy. He has everyone killed, which is why we'll just call him the king from now on. In the story, he mends his broken heart by turning it to stone. Every night after that, the king marries a young woman and kills her in the morning. The night he marries Scheherazade, we are not told what number wife she is. This is how the 1,000 nights begin, with Scheherazade entertaining the king with a story. Before she can finish each one, we are told the morning overtook Scheherazade, who lapsed into silence, leaving the king burning to hear the rest. And so each morning he spares her life in order to hear the end of the story. And each night Scheherazade weaves the tales together so that they always end on a cliffhanger. The brilliant part is that the king always thinks it's his idea for them to keep going. And an important part, she stops and lets the king fill in the story so he feels good. For 1,001 nights she does this, but really it's forever because we don't have all 1,001 stories recorded. Nobody wants them to end. They're all the stories people tell after dinner over glasses of tea, like with the phrase, "once upon a time," a storyteller will say. And so the following night, Scheherazade began her tale once again. There are endless variations from teller to teller. The tales of the three brothers and the djinn might be a comedy if you hear it in the market in Isfahan, and it might be a hero's journey around a bonfire in Ardistan. Every possible version exists somewhere. In the mind of Scheherazade, there are 1,000 times, 1,000 times, 1,000 tales. She tells them forever without stopping. Even this is one of them. But lunchtime has overtaken me, and I cannot finish my report on what I did this summer. What does this have to do with Aziz as she awaited her father, you might ask? How does this unconfuse anything? The answer is that now you know two true things. One, every story is the sound of a storyteller begging to stay alive. And two, the story of Aziz could have gone a million different ways. In a different tale, the Khan has an odyssey in the Azerbaijani hill country. He dances with every member of a village of lepers and heals them with nothing more than a kind touch. He steals a key ring from the horn of a sleeping jinn and throws it to a mermaid imprisoned on a salt stone in the center of a pink lake. He sits for tea in the den of a demon who believes in God, and together they write the saddest of poems, a poem so immeasurably sad that it quenches the flames of the demon's seat in hell. And he returns in time to tell it. The Khan returns in the final moment to save his daughter from her uncles, and this is not what happened. After just a few weeks, the Khan was considered dead, and the mansion in the saffron fields fell into decay. The World's War found Aziz and her mother and the old cook and the harvesters and put its calloused hand over their mouths. The fields went fallow. Hunger came on them like a bandit. Her mother sat all day with an untouched glass of tea and watched it cool. Aziz began to feel that her mother had also left her and would only return with the Khan. Aziz spent those famine days at the front window of the house in a state of half-reading. Carriages drove past the open courtyard, taking people to the cities to find work. One woman stuck her hand out of a carriage and let a man cut the bracelet from her wrist in exchange for a loaf of bread. The day her uncles came, Aziz witnessed the old cook carrying a pot of barley stew from the bonfire on the other side of the orchard to the main house, when a gang of people attacked him, spilling the pot onto the dirt. They pushed the cook aside, and then they fell to all fours and plunged their faces into the stew and the mud. Imagine you're evil, not misunderstood, not sad, but evil. Imagine you've got a heart that spends all day wanting more. Imagine your mind is a selfish room full of pride or pity. Imagine you're like Brandon Goff and you find poor kids in the halls and make fun of their clothes, and you flick their ears until they scream in pain and swing their arms, and so you pin them down and break their fingers. Or you spit in his food in the cafeteria. Or you just call him things like cockroach and sand monkey. Imagine you're evil and you don't do any of those things, but you're like Julie Jenkins and you laugh. And you laugh at everything Brandon does. And you even help when a teacher comes and asks what's going on, and you say nothing's going on, and he believes you because you got A+ in English. Or imagine you just watch all of this, and you act like you're disgusted because you don't like meanness, but you don't do anything or tell anyone. Imagine how much you've got compared to all the kids in the world getting blown up or starved, and the good you could do if you spent half a second thinking about it. Suddenly, evil isn't punching people or even hating them. Suddenly, it's all that stuff you've left undone. All the kindness you could have given, all the excuses you gave instead. Imagine that for a minute. Imagine what it means. Well, anyway, don't get too upset. You can always find somebody worse acting than you and say, at least I'm not as bad as that guy. And you can feel good and go to the mall and go back to being evil. Her evil uncles appeared on a cold early morning right after Aziz walked into the courtyard and found her mother dead. Aziz was only 10. She stood over her mother and thought, How will I tell this news to Father when he comes back? That was how out of touch she was, probably. She knew he was dead, but also in a different story, he was temporarily dead. She wanted to live in that other story. In a different tale, her mother would have died of heartache for her missing husband. In this one, disease. That was the story that actually happened. Aziz lost her dad, then lost her mom. Then the uncles arrived as if they had heard the news of their sister already, as if they knew Aziz had become the orphan heir of all the Khan's estate. She had no one but the old cook and the steward family who kept the orchards and the harvesters who lived in the village, but they couldn't defend her against her own kin. The uncles, I don't know what they looked like or how many. Let's make two. Both younger brothers to Aziz's mother, both squat and shaggy. No, wait, one is pinched and thin. Together, they look like a bird and an onion. One is the kind of villain who wants more for himself. The other is the kind who wants less for others. The one who looked and moved like a bird was the first to walk into the house and inspect everything, as if he just walked into a bazaar. The uncle who looked and smelled like an onion stood by the door, sweating. So the story goes that the uncles had whispered with a clerk in the village and given him gold. In exchange, they took the deed to all the Khan's fields. And what about their orphan niece? They would keep her, of course. She would care for the home. There is no more description of this time in Aziz's life because no one ever talked about it. The harvesters refused to call the uncles Khans. Under the watch of Mr. Bird and Mr. Onion, they marched into springtime fields so full of purple flowers they looked like carpets in the house of God. But Aziz never heard the harvesters laugh again. As she watched and mended, she only ever heard them say, "Don't worry, Aziz, June. Soon he will come of age and claim the Khan's inheritance." No one knows if Aziz felt better when she heard that sort of thing, because Aziz would never say, but it would have been better if she put her head down and helped the cook prepare the private meals for her uncles. It would have been better if Aziz never dared hope anything in those long 5 years. Because the version where she grows and takes her father's house back, that's not how the story goes. People get married for all kinds of reasons. I said that once in Mrs. Miller's class, and Julie Jenkins said, like love. And I said, or money, or protection, or just to talk to somebody, which is what I thought at the time because my mom married Ray. It seemed to me she just wanted someone who spoke Farsi like we did, and he was the only one we met when we got here. Mrs. Miller didn't know that, so she said, "Thank you, David. Let's stay on task." She called me David for the first few weeks, even though we told people to call me Daniel. They're both the same to me, so I didn't correct her. Ma and Pa love each other, adds Julie, and we go on reading Charlotte's Web. We lived in an apartment before Ray, Brentwood Apartments. It was a nice place. I once saw a kid explode his tongue with a car battery, so I guess it was the kind of place where they value education. His name was Tanner, and he was trying to kill the cockroaches in a drain ditch behind the apartments. He had the 2 prongs of jumper cables with the other and attached to the car battery, and he'd put them on the cockroaches. I was only there because Ray was shouting at my mom, and they'd send us outside. I played in the cement drainage area because Tanner told me someone had killed a kid in the woods last year, so I stayed away from there. "Come check this out," said Tanner. I didn't move. He jabbed the prongs into the ditch, under an open grate, and laughed. "I think you could kill a turtle with this." "Don't," I say. That made Tanner look up because I was telling him what to do. He could have probably killed me if he wanted. "What'd you say?" I would have run home, but Ray hit my mom a lot back then, and it was worse if we were around. I said, "Nothing. I thought, is there a turtle in there?" "No, idiot." He stuck the prongs in again. They made a zap sound. "It could fry up a bird easy," he said. When I had a dad in Iran, we had a house, and it was so beautiful. I dreamed about it sometimes. There's a smell I smell in those dreams. It could be a fake memory because one of the pictures we still have, a baby picture, was me in the backyard standing in front of a wall of white jasmine flowers and red roses. I'm smelling one in the picture, my sister says, like a sissy. Like a sensitive boy, my mother would say. I dream about that sunny jasmine smell, and we had a pool. And between my room and my sister's, the wall was one giant sheet of glass. Between us was a room with trees in it, inside the house, for doves to perch on. The ceiling of that room was glass too. Lights shined down all day on the potted trees, and the birds sang to each other. You could see it all from both rooms. I would watch my sister through the glass room playing. She wouldn't let me go around to play with her, but the memory is that flower smell, the glare of the glass, squinting to see my sister on her side with her dolls, and the birds in between sitting safe in their orchard. When I was a kid, I thought everybody had a glass bird room in their houses. I only ever remember birds being nice to me. I thought, why would Tanner want to kill them? With Tanner, I ask, how strong is it? The battery. He's got a pile of dead roaches already. He shrugs. I wonder if we'll go to the hospital today and tell them my mom hurt herself, and Ray will buy us dinner at a restaurant. An idea worms its way into Tanner's brain. He looks at the two prongs attached to the car battery. Like a bird, he cocks his head sideways. I say, don't. He slowly raises the prongs to his face. I don't have anyone to shout for because all the other kids in my class live in houses across town, and the apartment families won't talk to us because they say they may be poor. But they ain't dune coons that make foul-smelling food and yell at each other in gobbledygook. Tanner opens his mouth and looks at me big-eyed. He stands up to brace himself, but I don't dare him to do it. That's gonna hurt. I don't finish because he jabs the two prongs onto his tongue, and the zap sound is a juicy water balloon sound. Tanner's mouth is suddenly full, like he's blowing out his cheeks. He drops the cables and falls to his knees. I hear a scream from an apartment window. Tanner opens his mouth and a water balloon worth of blood pours out. More screams. Tanner's still coughing, like moms do when they get punched in the stomach. A chunk of his tongue is in the pool of blood. I run to get help and hear an ambulance coming. It could be for Tanner or my mom. Anyway, sometimes people get married just so he'll buy them a house, not one with a bird room, a little one with cockroaches. Maybe it's love most of the time, but that's a reason too. And it doesn't have to be because they want a father figure for their sons. That would be a terrible reason. You shouldn't put that kind of blood on a kid's head, because he would have said he didn't even want a house or a stepdad if it was all for him, like my sister said. Sisters can be evil like that. They tell you all the nightmares you ever had were your fault, and you were the reason somebody broke your mother's jaw. Anyway, Tanner came back 3 months later with a forked tongue. He'd stick it out like a snake, two nubs wiggling around. And anyway, maybe Ma and Pa in Charlotte's Web do love each other. Maybe I could have just read that and had a father figure to teach me how to treat mothers. Anyway, the only reason I said anything was that sometimes marriages give people houses and sometimes they take them away. Like for Aziz, she lost hers. Here's a version of the rest of the story that's mostly true. By the time Aziz turned 14, she had stopped glancing around the orchard every time she passed by, hoping to see the Khan riding up the road. She had buried him in her heart. The saffron fields under her uncle's control were just a great big red river of blood. Every day, she would wake the rooster who slept by the fountains in the courtyard. She would lean into the open gate of the reservoir and pull out 5 stones the size of cantaloupes that stopped it up. The water would flow into the paved channels in the courtyard to feed the apple trees and the grapevines. The truth is that she was lost after that. She wandered. One evening, her uncles appeared as she sat on a blanket pitting cherries and spreading them out to dry in the sun. Uncle Bird liked to stand when others sat. Uncle Onion sat and began eating the pitted cherries. Aziz was polite, but she was also 1,000 worlds away. "We have news," said Bird. Said Onion, and then slorp, 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 which was the sound of cherries mushing in his mouth. "News that will make you happy," said Bird. "Do you want to hear it?" "Yes, Uncle. You must both be hungry. We have dinner." But Onion was content devouring her day's work. We should tell you now, said Bird. It's a family matter. In that moment, Aziz dared hope. Was he alive? Had he returned? You are a married woman now, said Bird. Schlorp, schlorp, said Onion. He lives in Karaj. His name is Hassan. Aziz had never been as far as Karaj in her life. It was as far away as Edmond from the Gulf of Mexico. She said, Dear uncles, am I not helpful? Of course, said Onion. And as owners of this house, couldn't you let me stay? She referred softly to the fact that her uncles had long ago stolen the deed to the estate. There was no need to send her away. She would never inherit. Yes, said Bird, but we have reputations to think about. You're a woman now, Aziz. Aziz opened her mouth, then closed her mouth, then closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she was on a horse cart to Karaj with a small trunk of clothes and nothing to help her remember her mother or father. She never returned. Of course, Scheherazade would never let the morning come at the end of a story, or else the king would have no reason to keep her alive. Reader, you are the king, so let me tell you, when Aziz married Hassan, the two were already in love, and one of them was already destined to die. In Mrs. Miller's class, we make goodie bags for American soldiers in the war, and it is very important that I help as much as I can to prove whose side I'm on. Class, she says, looking at me, be sure to sign your name at the top of the card. Jared S. draws a bunch of fighter jets shooting arrows at monkeys on camels. Mrs. Miller comes by and makes her lips a straight line, but doesn't say anything. Brianna is the best at bubble letters, so she writes, We support the troops. And Kelly J. helps her color the American flag with hearts where the stars should go. The soldiers are in Iraq to kill Saddam Hussein, who's evil. I raise my hand, and Mrs. Miller calls on me from her desk. Saddam Hussein is evil, I say. Don't write that, please, she says. Okay, but I hope we win, I say. Some of the kids have uncles in Iraq, and lots have family who work at Tinker Air Force Base in Midwest City, Oklahoma. A lot of them think my family is Mexican, which is what wetback means. But if they see Ray's beard or hear my mom talking to us in a grocery store, they come up and tell us, my brother-in-law works every day at Tinker to protect us. At this moment, we will be trying to pick out juicy oranges, so my mom will say something like, yes, good. Then they'll say, we support the troops around here, and walk off. Some say, F Saddam. I want to tell them that when I was 3, Saddam was at war with Iran. He bombed Isfahan every night trying to kill people, and my uncles fought him. One of them has a twitchy face from the chemical attacks. One night, when I was a baby, the building next to ours was hit and the whole thing collapsed. My mom says she ran into my room and I was still asleep. I was super fat and a sleepy baby, which is the best kind of baby, and I even slept through bombs. So the point is that Iran is not the same country as Iraq. This should be obvious because they have different names, but then Doug C. leans over and says, hey, you from Iraq? No. If I ever see a dune coon, you know what I do? What's a dune coon? Arabs. I'm not Arab. Okay, but you know what I do? What? Iraq, Iran. He says Iraq. He says again, Iran. I'd kick him in the balls. He laughs. I kind of laugh because it's joking, and joking's a shared thing. Mocking is a joke that is not shared. I laugh a little to acknowledge that he has shared his joke with me. Then I tell him, I signed my name Daniel. Good for you, he says. That way the soldiers won't think I'm trying to poison them with my tin of cookies. Also, I don't have a problem with Arabs. I'm just not one. Also, kicking someone in the nuts and then running is a coward thing to do. But I guess there isn't a country for Iraq. I gloat. I am in love with Kelly J., who thinks I am disgusting, even though I finish worksheets faster than all the other boys. She seems to value Tyler L. for his shirts with surfing lizards on them. There is no helping this. I did not have the t-shirts that she likes because they are from a store called Gadzooks, which is in the mall of new clothes. I only have my love and used clothing. I used to believe that you could not choose who you love any more than you could choose the picture on a used shirt. But the truth is, that no one is innocent in love, and nobody forced me to love Kelly J. I don't want to stop. I don't want to stop just because she laughs at me. I want to stay in love with her until she realizes I am a person. It is a complicated thing that a little kid or even a fifth grader can't understand, that we are always choosing situations that hurt us. We choose them so deeply that we don't know we choose them. We think we had to. We think the world did it to us. And then we think, what a horrible world that makes a weapon out of love, that stabs you with it, even when you can't defend yourself and the other person hates you and wants to see you cry. It's a miracle that anyone would ever fall in love with someone else. And of all the people in the world, that person loves them back. Like if you fell off a building and landed in a pillow truck somehow. It doesn't happen, basically. Which means we end up with someone and there's lots of choosing to do. Choosing to forgive strange smells, or choosing that Gadzooks is not the only place that boyfriends can shop. That is the work of love. I never had a grandpa to tell me this stuff, so I could be completely wrong. I mean, I only have the memories of people quitting love, so I've seen it. I've seen love take hard work that they don't want to do anymore. They just decide their own kids aren't worth it. My dad. They tell themselves it's okay to give up because love should be like the TV shows where you float uncontrollably on the smell of others' perfume. They lie to themselves with stories of Aziz and Hassan, whose love, they say, was like Khosrow and Shirin, a legendary love, a love so big that it was a mountain. It would sink the earth to the bottom of the well of the universe. Here's an interesting question that I heard once in church. Can God create a mountain so big that he himself couldn't lift it? It's trying to put God in a corner because if he can or if he can't, he's not all powerful. But the question is silly because it assumes God is as stupid as we are. If you're as big as God, there's no such thing as lifting. It's all just floating in a million universes you made. If you made an object of some insane, unusual size, then it'd still be a thing. And God is as big as everything at once, and as small. Physical stuff is too simple. The better question is, can God create a law so big that he himself has to obey it? Is there an idea so big that God doesn't remember anything before it? The answer is love. Love is the object of unusual size. At 14, Aziz was a beauty, but this would be difficult for anyone to know because girls at that time stayed home. So a boy didn't know who to call on, which meant going to their house and asking the parents if he could court their daughter, which meant sitting in a parlor with her and talking to see if he wanted to get married. So moms came up with strategies. At the public baths, they would look for the beautiful girls and tell their sons to go calling at their homes. Or people would look at the brothers. If the brothers had soft, flowy hair and nice cheeks and pretty eyes, people could assume his sister would too, so she'd get a bunch of callers. But if the brother was a hairy bore, like if he spit a lot and had a giant nose, people would imagine it on a girl's face, and that sister would have lots of time to read. The word for those guys was sister ruiner. Aziz didn't have any of that when the horse cart rode into Karaj, the brother to help or hurt her reputation, the mother to watch out for her at the baths, or the father to stand at the door and look strong. She was beautiful and alone. I do not know how the story goes exactly, only that Persian love stories are all tragedies. To explain love, I have to tell you 3 stories. The first is the myth of Khosrow and Shirin. The second is the legend of Aziz and her husbands. The third is the history of how I broke my thumb at my mom's church. The myth of Khosrow and Shirin and its relation to my mom and the Miami Dolphins and church. When I was a kid, before Oklahoma, my name was Khosrow, and everybody could say it because everybody knows Khosrow was a Shah in the year 500. I told you that already, didn't I? Scheherazade repeats herself all the time, just so you know. Khosrow, I'll stop writing it so you can stop skipping it, was the famous king who made the carpet called the Spring of Khosrow, where the rubies and emeralds were flowers in the golden field. It was one of the legendary treasures of the old world. You remember this, yes? I always imagine the king laid the rug in his audience hall so that everyone who came to petition him could step on the greatest treasure in the kingdom. This would be such a Persian thing to do. A farmer walks in and doesn't even realize it until his muddy boot treads on a bouquet of jasmine made of pearls, and he says, "Oh," and then realizes he soiled the magic carpet of the greatest empire in the world and says, "Oh." And the Persian king, being super Persian, goes, come in, no matter the carpet." "1,000 apologies," says the farmer, falling to his knees to wipe the pearls with his shirt. "Don't trouble yourself," says the king. This is how Persians host. There are very important rules to treating guests with honor. The farmer would just keep apologizing. They would go back and forth until the farmer wiped the rug clean. "Forever my deepest apologies, O king. You are more valuable to me," the king says, "than any rug, even though the rug is more valuable than 3 countries. "I will leave," says the farmer. No, says the king, "but perhaps—" "I will remove my shoes," says the farmer, finally catching on. "That might be good, but only if you'd like to." Of course, says the farmer, retreating to the entry and pulling off his boots. "I will have someone bring you my own boots." "No, I could never," says the farmer. This is called tariff, by the way, this politeness that goes on forever. Of course, or perhaps my socks." "I am unworthy of the king's socks, but if the king pleases, so I don't muddy your sacred hall, may I have a basin to wash your feet?" "Yes, if you please." "Of course," says the king. And they go on like this for hours, honoring each other. So you should know, when a Persian tear off shoe, there are rules. I can't tell you them now because I'm in the middle of a story, but you should know these rules because they're just trying to give you respect. Otherwise, you end up making everyone feel like garbage. Like, you already know the American rule that when you walk into someone's house, you don't go, "Nice couch," and then climb all over the couch with your shoes on. It's that kind of thing. In Oklahoma, when people from church come to our apartment, they don't ask if they should take their shoes off. They just walk on the rug. But then our rug isn't very nice, so maybe they aren't embarrassed when they get mud all over it. It's the most expensive thing we have because our TV is a hand-me-down. But it's still not that nice. My mom doesn't say anything because they never start the tear-off and they never realize when she's doing it. Khosrow had a son named Hormizd the fourth, who had a son named Khosrow the second. It was the grandson who grew up and fell in love with a woman named Shirin. Like Aziz, Khosrow II had 2 evil uncles who killed his father, Hormizd, so that they could control him and take everything. This was when the Persian Empire was so big that uncles and princes each got their own countries to play with. The saddest moment, I think, is that when his brothers grabbed the king in his palace, they blinded him first. I imagine one version of the story where the king falls to his knees before his ungrateful guests and looks at his father's great gold springtime carpet, maybe focuses on a single poppy flower made of rubies stitched around yellow diamonds with one black pearl at the center, and he watches as the boots of traitor soldiers tread it with the blood of his loyal servants. And that's the last thing he sees before the hand of eternal darkness covers his eyes, a poppy red like blood. So no one ever told me if Khosrow II was part of the plan to kill his own father. I never imagined the king looking up to see his son standing in the poppy field. They probably didn't tell me because I'm named after him, and it would be a curse to be named after a treacherous son. All my mother ever said was that Khosrow II had his uncles killed, and he was the best-looking boy in the 5th grade. As for his love story, here are the lessons. When Khosrow was a young man, his friend told him about an Armenian princess named Shirin, which means sweetness in Farsi. Anyway, Khosrow fell in love with her, just from the descriptions from his friend, that she was a super finishazam with peridot eyes and one of those noses that look like a pinky finger and not a thumb. The lesson here is that you can fall in love with the story you have in your head. And the same happened to Shirin, who fell in love with Khosrow just by looking at a picture of him. You can imagine people a certain way, and it's like you created them, like a whole new Kelly who doesn't roll her eyes so much. So the boy is all googly-eyed over the story within the story of the girl, but this isn't a Disney movie, so he doesn't just float over to Armenia. What happens is a warlord named Cobin shows up with an army of Khosrow's palace. Cobin had been a general in Khosrow's dad's army and had been dismissed for a losing battle. He was humiliated, and there's nobody more dangerous than a kid who feels like that. Cobin's rebel army probably all felt like that, fighting with tears in their eyes and embarrassed for being babies who cry. And that army, the Masloum army, that one always wins. So Khosrow had to run away, and Cobin became the king of the Persian Empire. When Khosrow reached Armenia, he wasn't any better than a refugee, and Shirin wasn't as blonde as Kelly J. The lesson here is that people have scales in their heads, and they measure other people for their value, and ugly refugee boys are near the bottom, and pretty blonde girls are at the top. This is not a happy lesson, but you either get the truth or you get good news, and you don't often get both. Anyway, Khosrow was actually handsome, so that helped. When they met, they fell into magical love. In the story, Khosrow sees her naked while she's bathing, and Shirin says she'll never marry him unless he gets his kingdom back. So maybe that tells you way too much about magical love. Then Khosrow goes to Constantinople to ask the Caesar for an army to go back and defeat Cobin. The Caesar says, okay. Okay, says Khosrow. He was probably expecting some tariff, some backing and forthing, but the Caesar gets right to the point. Okay, you can have my army, but you have to marry my daughter Miriam. Which one's Miriam, says Khosrow, and the Caesar points to a girl picking her nose in the corner. The lesson here is don't ask anybody for anything you can't pay for. Or maybe it's that nobody cares if two lovers get together. That's like a cake only they get to eat. But nobody likes to watch someone else eat cake. I don't know the lesson exactly at this point. Honestly, Mrs. Miller, not everything has a lesson. It's a complication that Khosrow agrees to. He marches back to Persia with an army and a wife and smacks Cobin so hard for wrecking everything that Cobin flees to Fergana, which is like saying he runs away to Mars. And even then, Khosrow's so furious about having to beg the Caesar and being homeless when he meets Shirin and being forced to marry Miriam that he hires an assassin to sneak into Cobin's fortress and stab him to death. A tip-top love story so far. But by the time Khosrow finished with Cobin, he heard a rumor that broke his heart. Like maybe he was in the library during lunch and his friend came in and told him that a Finnegan's named Farhad, who is some kind of sculptor with dimples and everything, had started hanging out with Shirin after school. Sculptors can't be rivals to kings, said Khosrow, so he sent Farhad into exile to a mountain called Behestun and told him he couldn't return until he carved a staircase into the stone cliffside all the way up the mountain. Rival for what? Said Miriam probably. Said Khosrow. The lesson here is that if you watch the side characters in a love story, you might notice the lovers reacting or treating them like garbage with the excuse that they're doing it for love. But another lesson might be that maybe you're not the hero of every story, and maybe Farhad was Shirin's true love. Or maybe there isn't just one person designated for everybody. Maybe there's a lot more to it. Maybe you choose and you practice, and that's what makes the love true. Farhad had chosen to love Shirin and threw himself into the task of sculpting the face of the world. He carved the stone of Behestun into a staircase, one step at a time, all the while dreaming that he'd reach the peak of the mountain, and by then he'd have changed the world. He could fly directly into the arms of Shirin, and all that pain would become gladness. When Khosrow heard that Farhad was making progress, that day and night he worked at carving the rock and loving Shirin. Khosrow was filled with jealousy. He sent a message to Farhad. It reached Farhad on the mountain by a bird. Farhad held the creature in his calloused and dusty hands and pulled a roll of parchment from the tube tied around its leg. It said, Shirin is unhappily dead. Do not return. Here is a list of more mountains. On the back was their list, but Farhad didn't read it. He had reached the top of Behestun, the last step. He could see if he squinted, and if his eyes weren't full of tears, all the way to Armenia, and he thought of all the pain he had eaten to see Shirin again, her face. He screamed words in the unknowable language, and he jumped. and he did not fly. The lesson here is that your happiest memories can become your saddest all of a sudden. Khosrou was so stupid in this story that he thought he could have Shirin now that Farhad was dead. He never thought about poison, how it might infect his own life to hate his wife and kill some innocent man to get what he wanted. But that's a metaphor kind of idea. His heart had festered with murder and jealousy, so little by little he boiled away like all the loving parts. But in this story, there is also real poison. When Shirin heard that Farhad had jumped off the mountain, she must have known the reason. She must have known the truth about Khosrou. But people get married for all kinds of reasons, so she still wanted him. One thing that is interesting is that lots of poisons taste sweet. They're not like acid. They're like syrup. This is interesting because you can imagine Miriam taking a drink of mulberry cordial one night and saying, Shirin, which is the word for sweet, and also the word for her killer. Miriam died clawing at her own throat, trying to scrape or squeeze the Shirin poison back out as it ripped her apart. But remember, this is a love story, and the lesson here is that people are unlikable. They have the irritating habit of believing they are as important as you are to a story. I might be especially unlikable to you because I'm not beautiful like Scheherazade or funny, but I still have her job to entertain you, and I want to be good. I want to give you something you treasure. I want you to like me, as if I was a person in your life. That doesn't make me beautiful, but wanting to please you is important too. That's what you want, after all, to be pleased. You'd be shocked how few people want what you want. Farhad and Miriam were conveniently dead, leaving Khosrou and Shirin to their love, except it was poison love now. They had both murdered someone for it. And if you thought this ended happily, then you haven't been paying attention. These stories are epic. So by this time, Khosrou had a son with Miriam, before Shirin killed her, obviously. The son was a teenager and into girls. Uh-oh, you might be thinking. And uh-oh is right, because this kid kills Khosrou so he could be with Shirin, the lady who killed his mom, but he probably doesn't know that. But before he could force her to marry him, Shirin went to the grave of Khosrou and drank poison. The end. There's a love story for you. Really makes your tummy tingle. The lesson here is that love is a many-parted thing. There is the part when you see someone beautiful, naked in a bath or not naked, and you want to be near them. There is the part when you decide not to marry someone else, which Khosrou didn't do. There is the part that makes you improve yourself, makes you practice controlling your fear and jealousy. There is the part where you choose every action so that it doesn't hurt the ones you love, even indirectly. There's a lot more to love than smooching. People are also many-parted things. Two Persian poets, Ferdowsi and Nizami, tell it differently, as if both of them lived with Shirin and remember her with their own flawed memories. In one telling, she's a Mazlum Finnegonzon who suffers. When she dies, it's because she was too pure for this world and too sad. That one doesn't mention her poison stash. In the other telling, she's the jealous maniac who murders Miriam and decides to kill herself when the sun insults her pride with a proposal. In the version I tell, she's a mix, like Mithridates, who drank all that poison so it wouldn't hurt him while he was exiled, and then returned and killed everyone. She's half defending herself, half burning the world down. Sometimes I add to Shirin's story by having her do the same thing. She was paranoid that someone would poison her like she did to Miriam, so little by little, she made herself immune. And then my twist in the last scene is that she drinks a whole cup to kill herself and nothing happens. Now you know how Persian love stories go. It's okay to be scared. When you ask people in Oklahoma how their great-grandparents died, they say almost all of them the same: cancer or heart disease, or if you get lucky, kicked in the head by a horse. Other than the horse one, you have to nod and agree with them that cancer and heart disease are totally normal and respectable ways to eat it. But if you say poisoned by the town doctor in a blood feud, then you get looks, courteous looks like, isn't he precious looks. And only then would you regret being agreeable when they said theirs. Why should you believe them? How would they know that their great-grandpa died of cancer? It's just a story someone told them. They weren't there. They just expect everyone to take their word for it. And people do, because the story is boring. Nobody cares the second after they hear it. It goes, cancer. Oh, yeah, he was young, too, only 47. Wow, want to get tacos for lunch? Don't be fooled by the wow. That was an I don't care wow. People are like that. They're immune to the sadness of others. Karaj is a mountainous city so far away from Behestun, where Farhad carved his love letter to Sharon, that you could fit 15 Edmond, Oklahomas in between. But in the shadow of every mountain, there is at least one lover who looks up and sighs and wonders if the world could be so easy as to give him love if he just climbed to the top. There are no mountains in Oklahoma. This is why people like the myths of Hercules and Rostam, the clarity that if they just completed their challenges, they could get what they wanted. But love stories are never so easy. You might climb the whole mountain and return only to find out that mountain climbers aren't your crush's type. My great-grandmother, Aziz, who was 15, loved Hassan, who was in his 20s, and the best thing I can say about it was that their love was clear. It was clear that Hassan did not need to cleave a mountain to win Aziz. Hassan owned the only auto parts shop in town. It was clear that Aziz liked this about him because she always called him a businessman, even after he met with the Karaji physician one day in the winter, and he called Hassan a cart donkey, and which eventually led to Hassan's death. They were in love. That much is clear. It was sometime in the 1940s. That part isn't very clear because I never asked about dates. They lived in a house. From the kitchen window, Aziz could watch each day as the snowcap marched down the mountain till winter. She made warm lunches of beef, cutlets, and tomato and saffron sauce on fresh bread, and walked the muddy path to Hassan's shop with extra crisp radishes and a thermos of hot tea in her gunny sack. Karaj in the wintertime is a snowbound city, and cars driving on the mountain road would often crunch into potholes and drop transmission parts or hubcaps. They were probably old-timey cars, too. This was the time when horses became cars and great khans became mechanics. If the people didn't care about cars, they would drive straight into puddles and flood their engines, as the physician did one day when Aziz made a dish of chicken stewed with plums. She brought the lunch to Hassan wrapped in a scarf that she imagined her father had given her. Hassan kissed Aziz quickly so the greengrocer across the street and his wife, who spoke to their individual cats more than to each other, would not spread rumors that the young couple were indecent. Aziz only ever weeps when she remembers this story and never tells it, so I will make up a scene to show you what my mother told me, which is that Hassan and the physician had a misunderstanding that led to a bitter feud. A truck pulled up in front of the auto parts shop just as Hassan raised his glass of tea. The sugar cube he held between his teeth was still dry when a man slammed the passenger door of the truck and marched toward the shop. He was shaped like a cashew, pushing his belly out and his forehead back. "How can I help you, doctor?" Hassan said. Or wait, maybe it starts even worse, like, "Hello, sir, how can I help you?" "Doctor," says the doctor. "Oh, very sorry. How can I help you, doctor?" Wait, no, this isn't working. He's the only doctor in the neighborhood, so it would be unlikely that Hassan wouldn't know him. In fact, straight to your face rudeness isn't a very Persian thing. It would be more subtle. Like the doctor wouldn't barge in. He'd look at the little carpet that Aziz had put down in the shop and he'd sneer. But he'd never say the rug was too dirty for him to step on. He'd just smile and say, "Oh, I didn't want to bother you while you dine." And he'd use a word for dine that means being a little lazy in the middle of the day. Hassan would tear up and say, "Please share some of my wife's tea." But the doctor would refuse, not even with a long drawn-out compliment. He'd just say, "Thank you, but I'm in a hurry." Can you imagine something that rude? That his hurry was somehow more important than a person offering tea, and even worse, his wife's tea, while his wife is standing right there? The doctor may as well have spit in Hassan's face. He just pushed past the part of the conversation where they would honor each other as humans and started making requests, as if Hassan was a servant. "My car is stuck in the mountain pass," said the doctor. "Were you driving it when it got stuck?" "Yes." "Yes, it spluttered and just stopped." "You flooded the engine." "How do you know?" "Was there smoke?" "No." "You flooded the engine." "It happened after a big puddle." "Yup." Aziz would have found something to do in the back of the shop, since it was getting heated and her presence would have made it worse. The doctor would have let the silence hang as if everything was obvious. Well, how can I help you?" Hassan would say, which is this context would mean get the hell out of my shop. "I need someone to tow my car and fix it." This would be the moment that Aziz, peeking from between a row of spark plugs, would see her new husband stop up a volcanic rage, as if it was a bottled gin. "I'm not a mechanic." "You sell auto parts?" "Yup." "So you're like a hospital without an ambulance." "I'm like a grocer who doesn't make you dinner." "You just sell the ingredients." "Yup." "Well, I have some advice if you'd like to improve your business." "Oh. Does it need an x-ray for a hangnail?" The doctor would suck his teeth and narrow his eyes at Hassan. To say the doctor pushed for expensive tests was like calling him a thief. Worse than a thief, a liar. He turned and walked away. And from that moment, Hassan and the doctor were sworn enemies. The way the doctor would tell it, when he described the fight to anyone who'd listen, was that Hassan was a lazy mechanic who didn't want to work on his lunchtime. The way Hassan would describe it, the doctor made impossible demands, treated him like a cart donkey, and insulted his wife. Memories are tricky things. They can fade or fester. You have to seal them up tight like pickles, and keep out impurities like how hurt you feel when you open them, or they'll ferment and poison your brain. Sometimes in a village in Iran or Edmond, Oklahoma, a dog and a cat will have such a vicious fight that both of them are changed forever. The cat limps where the dog's teeth got it right in the hind leg, and part of the dog's nose, cut by the cat's claw, dries up and stops working. The cat and dog make some kind of boundary and stick to their territory so they can pretend they won a kingdom the size of half a town, when really they lost a limb in the size of the other half. This was Hassan and the physician, who would not even share a butcher between them. Hassan would go in the evenings after closing his store and purchase from the butcher's wife, while the physician went in the morning to purchase from the butcher's son. Neither asked about the other, even though everyone knew their veiled comments about the villains in town were attacks. If you asked the butcher himself, he'd say, "Don't worry about that," because he was the kind of person who hated gossip and just wanted to work. And then he might say, "A man can hold two hearts in the same hand and not let them touch." And if you asked him what that meant, he would just tell you he needed to get back to work. The many-hearted butcher was right, of course. Hassan and the physician's feud wasn't good for anyone, and so most of the town ignored it. Like Mithridates, the town became, little by little, immune to the bickering. And so it never solved itself. No one ever said, "Ach, doctor, please," or "Ach, Hassan, enough with this madness." And so the bitterness fermented in its jar in the dark cellars of their minds. Love and lives are complicated, so I will tell you only two things that happened over the next few years, though you can imagine 1,000 little slights between the physician and Hassan. First, Hassan and Aziz had a baby girl, my grandmother, my mother's mother, and the only person who didn't visit was the physician. He left it to the nurses to care for Aziz in her bed. "If anything had gone wrong," said Hassan, seething. "Nothing has gone wrong, husband. Look at these pudgy arms." And second, Hassan began to come home in the evenings complaining of angels. "A shaft of white light from the ceiling," he would say, "but deep in the back of the shop, where there are no windows." "It appears suddenly?" asked Aziz as she held Ellie, who was called Ethraham then, which is really not even something that I can translate. but who later became Ellie. And so let's go with the ones you can read. So bright, I close my eyes and still see it burned into my vision, and a headache for hours after. When the complaints began to include a dry snapping sound, Aziz's worry became desperate. She was not yet 20 and her daughter was not yet 2 when the love of her life collapsed. She found him behind a row of timing belts when she brought a lunch of scallion pancakes. There are moments in life where you are alone with 2 cups and you have to pick one to drink. There are moments when the decision will change everything. Farhad on the mountain, my dad at the breakfast in Dubai, my mom in the safe house. You'll hear about those later. For now, there is this one, Aziz, with a fallen husband. To let him die was unthinkable, but to beg the physician to save him was equally so, since Hassan would only wake up to hate her forever. In the short minutes, Aziz decided it was better for him to be alive, to love Ellie, if not to love her. She ran across town knowing the physician would relish every moment of Hassan's wife begging for his life. The story of Hassan and Aziz is a love story with poison in it. When the physician came to their tiny house, he saw his opportunity. He gave Hassan a bottle of medicine and left as quickly as he could. For 3 days, Aziz fed Hassan the medicine, and for 3 days he got worse and worse until he died in her arms. In the morgue, they discovered that Hassan did not die of disease or from the collapse in his shop. Aziz realized it was the medicine that killed Hassan. Can you imagine what that felt like? Like your heart is an engine flooded with black acid, drowned and clenched and clotted. She ran back home from the morgue to find the medicine bottle, to give it to a judge, to convict the physician who had murdered her husband. But when she returned, the window of her kitchen was broken and all the evidence was gone. Maybe the lesson is that you never know the damage you might do when you're trying to help, or that a feud is a profoundly stupid thing. There is no lesson, maybe. Here in Oklahoma, people don't poison each other except with canned green beans that have a vague medicine flavor. I don't think they taste it because they've gotten used to it little by little. At church potlucks, they play a secret game of dumping random cans of food in casserole dishes and pretending their grandmothers gave them the recipe. Jell-O is their favorite. Campbell's mushroom Jell-O goes on everything. So does Velveeta, which is a cheese Jell-O that only sort of hardens. My mom is scared of their unnatural foods. She whispers to us that it's why the cancer rate is so high in America. It's a bored disease for rich people. I told that to my science teacher once. The preservatives cause cancer, and he laughed. He said the science was a little more complicated than that. My mom's a doctor, and he's just killing time before coaching volleyball, so eat all the Fritos and corn syrup you want. My mom makes cream puffs like they had at Octamar, and someone always asks what kind of store-bought whipped cream she uses. One lady wouldn't even believe you could make your own by whipping heavy cream. Like people in history didn't have whipped cream until a company started selling canisters that squirt out runny foam. Anyway, this story is embarrassing, so I'll tell you a few things first. 1, I have a cap now, which is what they call hats. A baseball cap, even though mine is for a football team called the Miami Dolphins. I've never been to Miami and never seen a dolphin. My newest friend likes them. My mom bought it for me so that we can declare our friendship. Other kids like the Cowboys and can never be best friends with a dolphin. The second thing to know is that I did not cry. Even when you're imagining this story, you'll probably imagine tears on my face when they took me to the hospital. Well, don't. At the potlucks of poor people churches in Oklahoma, the barbecue is always good. My friend who supports Miami wasn't there because his family goes to the big church across town where they serve banana pudding and put out like 7 different kinds of Pringles, which are the best chip. This story happens during the time Ray didn't live with us. because he'd broken my mom's jaw and we spent Christmas in First Baptist Hospital. He bought us Pringles and peanut M&Ms for dinner, but the hospital vending machines, from the hospital vending machines, and my sister and I told the police it was an accident. And by the summer, they were divorced. That was just the first time, though. Anyway, summertime potluck. Good barbecue, terrible everything else. No Ray, one Dolphins cap. A youth pastor named John Boy used to roam around the buffet with a group of high school kids, smiling for the old ladies and asking if any of them needed work done on their lawns. He had a truck, which all good men in Oklahoma have, with blue neon lights shining underneath it, which they don't. He argued with his dad, the head pastor, about the differences between old country music, which had grit, and new country music, which had music videos. John Boy didn't like me. His blue truck lights meant he represented the Cowboys. Some weeks, he would refer to matches I hadn't watched. That particular dinner, he saw me by the barbecue and told me the Cowboys would beat the Dolphins again next week. I said, "The Cowboys are the worst team in the league." John Boy blinked at me. One of the high school boys named Wes laughed. It turned out the Cowboys had won the Super Bowl last year, so they were the best team in the league. Wes had a brother my age named Bobby who was standing behind him. He snatched my cap and ran back to John Boy with it. "Hey," is a stupid thing to say, that I said. I looked around. All the groanies had their plates and were sitting at the table talking about horses or whatever. "Give me my cap," I said. John Boy was a refrigerator-sized man wearing a silk Hawaiian shirt that would fit me like a tent. Wes was a wiry hillbilly. Billy was a scrub. Not Billy, I'm sorry. Bobby was a scrub. He gave the cap to John Boy. "Give it," I said. "Or what? What'll you do?" said Wes. I stared at John Boy. He grinned at me. "Careful," said John Boy. He had a peanut butter cream cookie in his hand. He held it like he was going to smash it inside the hat. "I might ruin it." I couldn't tell if he was joshing me, which is when grown-ups pull a kid's leg. "It would be an improvement," said Bobby. I didn't know what was supposed to happen. I didn't even know the Cowboys played the Dolphins. John Boy brought the cap and the cookie close together. "Crush it," said Wes. But John Boy said, "Just say the Dolphins suck and you can have it back." I was alone. My new friend would never know I said it. It's the sort of lie that wouldn't cause any harm. And some people say it is not a sin to do that. But then some people say Edmond, Oklahoma looks like Italy in the springtime. Some people are idiots. I reached into the tub of barbecue and grabbed a handful of sloppy pulled pork. John Boy's eyes got serious. "Give me my cap," I said. A drop of barbecue sauce fell from my hand. No one ever explains their sense of humor. You have to guess if they're serious. In Oklahoma, they call these Mexican standoffs, where everybody has a gun on everybody else. "Don't," said John Boy. "Crush it," said Bobby. "I'll throw it," I said. "Say the Dolphins suck," said Wes. "The Cowboys suck," I said. John Boy smiled and put the cookie into the cap and started crunching it in his fist. I threw the pork as hard as I could. It splattered all over his silk Hawaiian shirt. Bobby cackled so loud that everyone turned and looked. I ran up and grabbed my hat with my clean hand. "You ruined my shirt," said John Boy. His voice was suddenly adult, calm and disappointed. His smirk was gone. It was like he was his dad all of a sudden. "You ruined my cap," I said. "Look," he said, and he showed me the peanut butter cookie. He'd crushed it in his hand under the hat. "That's not fair," I said. He tricked me. Now I was the bad one. "This shirt was expensive," he said. But I had told him I would throw it if I didn't lie. I said I would. I thought, my mom doesn't have the money to pay for the shirt. I didn't even like football back then. "I'm sorry," I said, but Oklahoma sports stories are all tragedies. So Bobby snuck up behind me again and snatched my cap again and ran out of the fellowship hall. I chased him. I heard John Boy shout after us, "Bobby, give it back." Here's everything I remember after that. I hit the double doors of the church and left a smudge on the glass. Outside was a summer night chill. I caught Bobby in the parking lot before he even reached the park on the other side. I tackled him to the ground. I grabbed for my hat. It was under him. I was on top. I turned him over. He was laughing. I grabbed for my hat. My hand still had sauce all over it. He had bent the bill in half. He thought it was hilarious. I was going to punch him, but I felt a shoulder smash into my back. It was Wes. He had his arms around my waist, trying to pull me off his brother. Bobby started shouting. His lip was bleeding. I was screaming, Peder sag Miko Shama. They didn't understand me. Wes pulled at my waist. I had my hat scrunched in one fist and Bobby's ear in the other. John Boy shouted something, who cares what. I hated all of them. Wes pulled until he slipped and had me just by the arm. I tried to wrench my arm away from him. I wanted to punch Bobby square in his nose. I didn't think I had punched him yet. Wes yanked on my hand that was holding the hat. I wouldn't let go of it. Wes tried to pry my fingers off of it. He finally pulled so hard I felt my thumb snap and separate to go with him. A white light, like a shooting star, blinding pain. He pulled again. I felt all the muscles in my hand stretch and tear around my thumb, like he was pulling a drumstick off a roast chicken. I screamed and let go of Bobby. Wes and I fell to the ground. John Boy ran out of the church along with the pastor and my mom. He said, "What do you boys think you're doing out there?" And that is all I remember before going to the hospital.